Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. I've been fascinated with external GPUs for the past year at this point. I have tried out a ton of different solutions, and none of them are perfect, but I have learned a lot along the way. So in this video, I want to talk about the overall state of using external GPUs as a PC gaming solution, the good and the bad that comes with it, and some of the frustrations as well. Now, the thing that really prompted me to reflect on external GPUs in general was a new doc that was sent over to me from MinisForum. Initially, I was working on a new mini PC review, and it's got an Intel chip like some others I've reviewed, and I haven't really been happy with those this past year, but they said, hey, we'll send over the dock too and you can try it out with that. Well, as soon as the dock arrived, I was like, oh, this is like way more fun and exciting, and so I started focusing on the dock, and now I've got enough footage to actually make a full video about that. I'm sure at some point I'll make a video on that mini PC, but for right now, I think the dock is just a lot more fun to talk about, so that's what we're going to cover here today. And it's called the DEG1, and there's a lot of things I like about it. The first is the price point. It's only $100. Secondly, it uses an Oculink port, which means that we're going to have super fast speeds with a single cable. And then finally, it's totally customizable. You can use whatever desktop GPU you would like, but then also whatever power supply you want too. And so really, this eGPU dock is shaping up to be an excellent solution, but there are quite a few caveats, which of course we will explain in this video. So the way I see it, if you have any interest in portable PC gaming, then I bet you'll find a couple nuggets in here. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, as we get started, let's talk about how I got into this whole external GPU thing in the first place, because it is a bit of a wild ride. It all started when I began this channel back in 2020. I was working out of my house. I didn't have a fancy studio like this back then, and that place is super crowded. There are 3 generations living in my house, and so I was basically working out of a closet. And I really just didn't have space for a desktop PC. There was a little bit of room underneath my desk, but then it would push hot air onto my feet, and living in Hawaii, especially during the summer, that was just a terrible experience. So I realized that I couldn't really work with a desktop PC. And so I started looking into mini PCs, and I've done a ton of reviews on this channel, and I've always been fascinated by how much computing power you can get in such a small package. And so I did that for a while, but then something came along that really screwed me up, and it was this thing, the XG Mobile from Asus. Now I got this as part of my review for the ROG Ally when it came out last year, and this little thing is an external GPU that basically satisfied all the problems that I'd had previously with mini PCs in that they were a little bit underpowered. This thing has a laptop 3080 Ti inside, and so what I did for about a year was I basically used this as my primary desktop PC. I would plug my ROG Ally into it, and then I get all my work done on this. And so I found the XG Mobile to be an awesome solution, but I found it to be very limiting as well because it's very proprietary. It's got a proprietary plug on it. There's no upgrade path for this. You can't put like a new GPU inside of it. This is just a one and done. And so at that point, I started looking at other eGPU solutions, the idea of using a handheld or a smaller PC and plugging it into something that was a lot more powerful. Now for years, the most popular eGPU has been from Razer. It's called the Razer Chroma. And there have been a bunch of iterations of this, although it's not for sale anymore. Well, last summer I did end up buying one, mostly to compare it with the XG Mobile, but man, that was a terrible experience. Number one, the GPU is massive. It's about the size of a small desktop PC. And we'll talk about some of the other issues I had with this later in the video. Now from there, I tried out a couple other eGPUs. These were both laptop based, much like the XG Mobile. And we'll talk about these more in detail in a moment as well, but the big thing about them is that they used an Oculink port, which gave me faster connection speed. And so leading up to this video, I had tried out 4 different solutions, and I hadn't been perfectly happy with any of them. The proprietariness of the XG Mobile, and then the price and the size of the Razer Chroma, and then also the limitations of these laptop GPUs from these other ones. And so that all leads us into today's video, which is talking about the MinisForum DEG1. Now in all reality, there's nothing really special about this dock. You can build your own if you know where to get the board and the cables and everything else, but there's also the convenience and just the clean look of a mass-produced device, and so that's the big draw for me. The other main draw for me was the price point. It's only $99 with free shipping, and it comes with an Oculink cable, which is usually going to be around $30 on its own. So I think we should just jump straight into an unboxing and kind of talk about it as we go along. And in full disclosure, this was sent over from MinisForum for review, but no money was exchanged in any way. They're not seeing this video ahead of time, and of course, all opinions are my own. There's not a lot going on inside of the box. We've got an appendix with a diagram, and we've also got that Oculink cable that I mentioned before. It is 2 feet long, and the shorter the better with these. The shorter they are, the faster the connection speed's going to be. On top of that, we've got a mounting bracket for the GPU, as well as a bunch of different thumb screws to lock everything in place. And that's really about it inside of the box other than the dock itself. Now this thing is really bare bones. We've got only 2 connectors here, and that includes the PCIe slot for your graphics card as well as the power plug for your power supply. On the left side, we've got our Oculink port as well as our SFX and ATX mounting screws for the power supply. And then on the right side, we just have a simple power button. Now underneath there is a panel with a bunch of screws, and you know me, I was super curious, and so I decided to take it apart and see what we had inside. And really, there's not a lot going on here. We can't make any sort of adjustments to the board itself. It's a very simple setup. So I guess if you just needed to repair it with a new board, this would be easy access, but otherwise you don't really need to get inside of it. Of note, the build quality here is pretty solid. We've got some nice rubber feet that keep everything nice in place. And then we also have some padding up top where we can place our power supply. And I assume this is to prevent any sort of static electricity, but it also feels pretty solid. Now, in terms of power supply, you can grab whatever you would like, although this dock is specifically made for SFX and ATX sizes. Now, for me personally, I wanted the smallest dock experience that I could find, and so I got the smallest power supply that I could get that had a good power rating. So I ended up picking up this one. It's called the SX500 from a company called Silverstone. I got it for about $115 on Amazon. Now the wattage of your power supply will really depend on how big of a graphics card you want to use. And the card that I'm going to be using only requires 220 watts, and so 500 watts is more than enough to power it. And also bear in mind that this power supply is only going to be powering the GPU, nothing else. And so unless you've got something like a 4090 that requires like something around 500 watts, then you can usually get something a little bit on the weaker side. Now this power supply was a little bit on the expensive side, but again, I made that choice on purpose. The number one thing here is I wanted something very small, but the second part is that I wanted something that was fully modular. And that means you'll be able to pick and choose which cables plug into the power supply, which is really important with a dock setup like this. Again, because we're only powering the graphics card, we don't need all the other cables that usually will come with a power supply like this. So looking at the back here, there are only 2 types of cables that we actually need in this setup. We need the full motherboard setup, which is going to be 20 or 24 pins. And then we also need the PCIe power for the graphics card itself, and this is going to come with 2 different 8-pin connectors. And so this is why I preferred to use a modular power supply, because I could just get rid of all those other cables. I wouldn't need them. Now, I had never actually seen an SFX power supply before, and I was amazed at how little this thing is. In fact, I think that I probably could have gone with a bigger ATX power supply and saved some money, but here we are. Okay, and finally, the last piece of the puzzle is our graphics card. So I'm going to be using an RTX 3060 Ti. I picked this up about a year ago, and that was when I was really getting into that whole Razer Chroma thing, and I thought this would probably be the best GPU in terms of price and performance for that kind of setup. And this cost about $350 last year, and I don't think that they sell it anymore, so you would have to get one of the more recent NVIDIA GPUs instead. But again, that's the wonderful thing about this kind of dock setup, is that you can use whatever GPU you would like, just make sure that you get a power supply that provides it enough power. Now the installation process is super easy with this, so we're just going to go through it pretty quickly. The left side has quite a few holes that are going to fit with whatever power supply that you use. And for me, it was as simple as just lining it up with the SFX ones and then using the thumb screws to put it in place. From there, we can install our GPU, which again will just slot into that PCIe port. And now we can use our power supply cables to hook everything up. First, I'm going to use the motherboard cable. It's going to be the widest one in your package. And I did have to take the power supply out just to make sure that I could seat it properly. And then after that, all we have to do is add our PCIe cables. And with my power supply, it was super easy because these had a blue connector on them, unlike the others. And so it was very easy to pick them out. And so really, installation took me about 1 minute altogether. And I don't really know what I'm doing with this stuff, but it was pretty plug and play. From there, your biggest problem is going to be cable management, just because, most power supplies don't anticipate that you're going to have everything so close together. But for me, I just took a couple cable ties and that fixed everything nicely. And it really doesn't have to be super pretty. If you think about it, when you're actually setting this on a desk, you probably won't see any of these cables anyway. So finally, the last thing we need to do in terms of installation is just to add that mounting bracket for the GPU. And this has all been measured out perfectly, so you can just connect it to the power supply and then the GPU. And so there we go. That was the full installation process, and here is our final setup. And personally, I think it looks pretty sleek. I like the idea of having an open air dock like this, just so I can see all the spinning fans. It looks pretty cool. Not only that, because we're not enclosed inside of a PC case, it actually stays very cool as well. In all the testing that I did over the past couple weeks and really pushing it as far as I could, I never saw the GPU get above 67 degrees Celsius. Not only that, there wasn't a lot of hot air being blown anywhere either, and so it was just kind of a really cool experience in many ways. On top of that, the fans on the GPU and the power supply are super quiet. I think it has to do with the fact that they're not enclosed, and so there's no sound reverberating anyway. And so as a result, I found this to be actually the quietest setup that I've found for any eGPU solution, and so that's been one of the big draws for me. Now, I think the aesthetics are probably an acquired taste. I think that many people will probably not want to have a bunch of like technology right there on their desk, but I don't know, I kind of like it. There's even a tiny little part of me that wishes that I had some RGB lighting on my GPU, because I think that would look really nice too. Okay, so now that we have the whole GPU setup figured out, let's talk about the devices that I used hooked up to it. And for my tests, I wanted to use two different products. The left one is just a full-on mini PC, and then on the right, I wanted something more portable, like a handheld or a laptop. Let's talk about the mini PC first. This is the MinisForum UM780XTX. And I did a full review of this thing last year, and I'll leave it linked down below. And this comes with a Ryzen 7000 APU, as well as a terabyte of storage and 64 gigs of RAM for about $650. And honestly, this is one of my favorite mini PCs that came out last year, and of course, most importantly, it has an Oculink port. And as you've probably figured out, an Oculink port is essential when using an Oculink dock. Now, when it comes to more portable devices with Oculink ports, it's pretty slim pickings. And there are a couple from INEO and a few from GPD, including this one here, which is the WinMax 2. Now, this one is last year's model, and it has a Ryzen 7000 APU in it, just like the mini PC. And I also did a full review on this one, and I do really like it in many ways. When it comes down to it, this is like a gaming/productivity netbook. In addition to all the laptop things that you can do with it, it actually has built-in controls so you can use it like a gaming handheld as well. Just bear in mind that all the functionality of this laptop is super cool, but it does come at a price. And so if we take a look at this year's model with an 8000 series CPU inside, you can see that it costs about $1,150. But bear in mind that we'll have 2 terabytes of storage and 32 gigs of RAM as well. So that's probably the first thing to really bear in mind, is that you're going to have some limited connectivity with this eGPU dock because it only uses Oculink. And so you will have to shop around to find mini PCs or handhelds that have an Oculink port. And unfortunately right now they are fairly niche. Now, I'm a big fan of Oculink because of its fast connection speed, and I think that other companies are paying attention. For example, during CES this year, Lenovo talked about one of their ThinkBook laptops that will have an Oculink port. Now, unfortunately, it still hasn't released yet, but it's called the ThinkBook 14 Gen 6 Plus. And if you look at its specs, you can see that yes, it has that Oculink port. They call it a Lenovo TGX port, but it's the same thing. However, it's only been released in China at this point, and so we have not seen it in North America yet. So I do hope that we will see a wider range of product with Oculink, and we'll see why, because the performance is pretty great. Now, anytime I talk about any sort of eGPU, or even a mini PC in general, one of the most common questions or comments that I get is something along the lines of, why not just make your own desktop? And I think that's a totally valid question, so let's tackle that really quickly. And honestly, I think there are only really 2 reasons to even be interested in an eGPU in the first place. And the first will be if you're like me and you have any sort of space constraints. For example, here is a desktop PC that I built back in 2020, and you can see here that it's a micro ATX PC case. And you can see that even though this is a smaller case, all things considered, it really does dwarf that GPU dock. And so even when combining it with something like a mini PC, you are getting a much smaller footprint all around. Now, for me personally, I do think that using a mini PC with an external dock like this is a little bit weird. And that's because we have 2 different things that are completely stationary. We've got a small mini PC hooked up to a small dock as well. And I think in terms of overall aesthetics, it doesn't look really good to me. It just really feels like a deconstructed PC at that point. So I think unless you're really constrained by space, or you like the idea of piecemealing together your PC setup, then an eGPU dock like this with a mini PC doesn't make as much sense. However, if you have a portable device, like a laptop or even a handheld with an Oculink port, then I think this makes a lot more sense. And I think that the WinMax 2 is probably the ideal solution for a dock like this, because it works on its own like its own laptop. So you can take this around, maybe take it to work or take it on a project, and it's going to give you full functionality, but just at a lower power profile. That gives you an opportunity to use it for work. For example, if you need to type out a paper, or if you want to do a little bit of light gaming on the go, this is also going to be great. And then of course, when you're home, you can take that same computer and connect it to that GPU dock and have a desktop experience. And for me, that's an ideal solution, as opposed to having a laptop as well as a desktop. That means you're going to have to share files and all that other kind of stuff, as opposed to just having one machine that can do it all. And so for me personally, I totally do see the merit in having a laptop like the WinMax 2 connected to an eGPU dock like this. Now let's talk really quickly about installation, because this is a three-part process. Most of these Oculink-based devices are going to run with an AMD APU. That means you need to make sure that you have the latest drivers installed. From there, I recommend using an NVIDIA GPU as opposed to an AMD one, because there have been conflicts with AMD APUs and AMD GPUs. And so the easiest way to get around that is to use an NVIDIA graphics card like the one I'm using. Now, to install an NVIDIA graphics card on an AMD device is a little bit tricky. The first thing you'll have to do is set everything up, then connect that dock via Oculink to your computer. Once you have that set up, you'll be able to go to the NVIDIA website and download and install the latest drivers for your GPU. However, one of the things I learned as part of this process is that often an NVIDIA graphics card is going to crap out with this kind of setup. Now, thankfully, I have a lifeline, and that's the Fox over on YouTube. This guy has been doing these kind of setups for years, and so he knows all the ins and outs. And so on a lark, I contacted Carrie and I said, hey man, like I've been installing this GPU, but after I do the installation and restart the machine, I get all these errors. And within 2 seconds, he was like, oh yeah, that's an error 43 thing. You need to use this script. And so I'll leave this script down below, and this thing was a lifesaver because all I had to do was just run this one time, and it's been working great ever since. And so that's what I mean by a three-part installation process. Make sure your own drivers are up to date, then install the NVIDIA ones, and then use that error 43 script. And after that, the setup is going to be pretty seamless, but you have to bear in mind that Oculink is not plug and play. And so there is a process to getting this hooked up. First thing you need to do is connect the GPU to the computer, and of course you'll just need to use that one single cable. From there, you need to turn on the GPU dock first and give it about 5-10 seconds, and then turn on your PC. And after that, you should be good to go, but just bear in mind you will have to power down your computer again before you unplug everything. Okay, so now that we've got an idea of how the whole eGPU thing is going to work, let's now talk about price and competition. As a quick recap, here are the three components we need for this whole setup. It's going to be $100 for the DEG1, which will come with its own Oculink cable and free shipping. From there, you're going to need a power supply. I got one that was around $115, but you can get something much cheaper if you don't mind getting something bigger. And then finally, we've got our graphics card, and obviously the price on this is going to vary by how much power that you want. However, all things considered, I think it's a pretty solid deal. For about $200, we're going to get a full Oculink dock as well as that power supply. From there, it's just a matter of using whatever graphics card fits your budget. Now, like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, for years, the main option that we've had when it comes to eGPUs has been the Razer Core X. And this is a Thunderbolt 3 eGPU as opposed to Oculink. Now, there are some benefits to this one. For example, it comes with its own 700-watt power supply. But there are two main detractors. The first is that they just don't sell it anymore. You can't find it on the Razer website, and it's not on Amazon anymore. And then, of course, the huge sticking point is that this thing is so expensive, I just can't recommend it. It is $500 retail. And so if you were taking notes a moment ago, that means that this is about the same price as the MinisForum dock we're reviewing today, but this one doesn't have a GPU at all. So you will still have to buy the GPU to actually put inside this machine. Either way, I personally did pinch my nose and buy one just because I wanted to use it for the channel and just to get a better understanding of how this whole eGPU thing works. And so here is the Razer Chroma that I bought last year. And it's actually been at my son's desk for the past year. He's been using it with another mini PC plugged in, and so he's been able to play Minecraft and all his favorite games this way. So it has gotten a lot of use over the past year, just not really from me. Now, one nice thing about this thing is that it actually works as a USB dock as well. So on the back, it has 4 different USB-A ports as well as an Ethernet port. So it does expand the amount of ports that you can use with your PC. And so my son has really appreciated that. But for my part, I've just always found this thing to be ridiculously large and heavy. Even when you take it outside of its case, it's still very big. And that probably comes from the fact that it has a large power supply. It also has its own case fan too, to make sure that everything is nice and cool and circulated. But even then, in terms of just overall size and portability, it is quite a bit larger than the MinisForum DEG1 that we're reviewing here today. The other thing to bear in mind is that the performance bandwidth available on a Thunderbolt 3 port is going to be a lot lower than Oculink. We're going to do benchmarks in 3 different categories. We're going to start with just the MinisForum itself running its own APU, and then we'll do the same thing but with the Razer Chroma with my 3060 Ti inside. And then, of course, from there, we'll use the MinisForum one with the same graphics card but with an Oculink port instead of Thunderbolt 3. And I found 2 really interesting things here. When I did 3D Mark tests with TimeSpy, I found that yes, there was of course a large difference between the APU and the graphics card setup. So on the top left, you can see just the MinisForum itself, and we got a score of 3343. That's about what I would expect from a Ryzen 7000 CPU. Now on the bottom left, we have the Razer Chroma. This has got a score of about 11,000, which is actually pretty decent with the 3060 Ti with the Thunderbolt 3 connection. In fact, it's within about 10% of the score with the RTX 3060 Ti using the MinisForum dock. And so between the two, at least looking at 3D Mark's TimeSpy score, you might be thinking, wow, this is actually pretty decent. However, I found that when in real-world testing, there was a huge difference between using a Thunderbolt port as well as the Oculink one. Let's do another benchmark, this time with an actual game to illustrate my point. So in Horizon Zero Dawn, using a 1440p resolution, I got an average frame rate of 27 frames per second with the APU, and that's about what I would expect. Personally, I would rather play this game at 1080p, but I decided to use a standard resolution regardless. Now with the Razer Chroma, and again at 1440p resolution, we got just shy of 43 frames per second. And I think that's also pretty decent, and I think that's perfectly playable. I would probably play this at 1440p and then cap it at 40 frames per second to get a smoother frame rate. However, all of those stats kind of go out the window the moment I tried out the Oculink port. And so again here with 1440p resolution and high settings, I got an average frame rate of 106 frames per second, which is well over double the Razer Chroma. And overall, I found this to be just a much smoother gameplay experience all around. With the Razer Chroma, I would often find myself finding just weird dips when I was playing the game, to the point where I didn't find it to be as enjoyable. Meanwhile, with the Oculink port, I got a much more stable frame rate and much higher as well, usually about double of the Chroma. And I think this is really where the value of the DEG1 really comes into play. This thing costs just a fraction of the Razer Chroma, but it gives it just about twice the performance. The real limitation here is going to be whether or not the device you want to hook it into has an Oculink port. Okay, let's move into testing now. I'm going to use the WinMax 2 for the rest of the testing in this video, and that is mostly because I think that the WinMax 2 and this dock are probably the perfect pairing. So for the rest of this video, we're going to use the Ryzen 7 7840U CPU from last year, as well as the Radeon 7080M integrated graphics. And we're going to do all my testing with a 28-watt TDP docked into a capture card. And for the most part, I found that this performance will be relatively decent at around 900p or 720p at around medium to low settings. That should give you a good frame rate of around 30 frames per second for games like Marvel Spider-Man. And we'll start by doing a couple side-by-side comparisons. We'll start with Doom Eternal. Here, just using the integrated graphics, I'm playing it at 900p with medium settings, and I'm getting an average frame rate around 60 to 65 frames per second. And I think that is pretty decently playable on a system like this. Now, if we take that same WinMax 2 and we plug it into the eGPU dock, you can see that I can bump up the resolution to 1440p, and then the settings all the way up to Nightmare. And here I've turned off VSync so I can see just exactly the frame rate I'm getting, and it's ridiculous. It's like 260 frames per second. So obviously between the two, there is a mountain of difference in terms of performance and graphical fidelity and just overall feel. But I think this is probably a very extreme example of what it's like with and without a GPU. Let's try something else just to see how it goes. So here is God of War, again playing it at 900p resolution at low settings. And here with a 28-watt TDP, I get an average between 35 and 40 frames per second. Still very playable with this game. Meanwhile, if we bump up that resolution and the settings to 1440p and high with that eGPU dock, I get an average frame rate around 85 instead. So here we are effectively doubling our frame rate while also having a higher resolution and also higher settings. And I think this is a pretty ideal use case where you could play God of War on the go if you needed to in a pinch at a lower settings, and everything would work out pretty well at around 35-40 frames per second. But then once you're home, if you really wanted to have that full desktop experience, you can have that as well. Let's try another one as an example. I've been playing Elden Ring quite a bit over the past few weeks, although I have not gotten far at all. At this point, I've just been grinding around the castle and trying to kill all these soldiers, but the highest ranking one always kills me every time. Either way, at 1080p in low settings, I can get a good frame rate, around 45 frames per second, which I think is decent with the WinMax 2. However, if you plug it into the dock, you can get a much smoother experience at 1440p in high settings, and even then I can lock it at 60 frames per second, and I'm only using about half of the GPU's power anyway. So this has been a great solution for me when I'm trying to practice playing this game. Another great thing about this setup is that it will unlock some games that just aren't very playable on the WinMax 2 on its own. A good example here is when I was trying to playtest Cyberpunk 2077. 2077. I had set this to a 28-watt TDP and 720p with the Steam Deck settings, and at first I was getting a good 30-35 frames per second, which I think would be playable. However, after a couple minutes of playing, I found that the integrated graphics got really hot, around 95 degrees Celsius, and it got to a point where it started to throttle the performance down to the point where I was getting an average of about 15 to 20 frames per second. And so just in general, using the integrated graphics with the WinMax 2, it got capped out really quickly. Meanwhile, same story when we plug it into the dock, 1440p, high settings, and getting an average frame rate of around 60 or 55 frames per second. And of course, this is a much smoother and more enjoyable experience. And so really, when it came down to all the testing that I did with the dock, this was kind of the sweet spot for me, is trying to play games in 1440p and then push up the settings, usually too high. At this point, the limitations of the setup didn't really have to do with the dock itself, but rather the graphics card that I had. Regardless, my biggest takeaway here was that this was a very consistent experience. I could just set it to 1440p in high settings, and most games would just work without any other tweaks after that. And I think having a solid eGPU solution that gives me 1440p gameplay is about the threshold of what I'm looking at anyway. And so barring the entire cost of the Oculink device in the first place, I think that the dock itself with this kind of setup is probably worth it around $550. Now, like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, there are other eGPU solutions out there, so let's add that context as well. And so let's take a look at each of these two, which are actually using laptop GPUs inside and the exact same graphics card as well. We'll start with the GPD solution. This one is called the G1, and it has a Radeon RX 7600M XT. Now this one is unique in a couple different ways. To start, it has both Oculink and Thunderbolt connectivity, and so you can use either of them or both depending on the device that you have. In addition, it also works as a USB-C dock, so you have additional ports as well as an SD card slot, and it has the power supply built in, so all you really need is the power cable, so this is very travel friendly. And I made a full video about this one as well as the next one, which is the 1X GPU. This one has the same Radeon graphics card, but is a little bit more expensive. This one is $750 after you buy the cable. And it's a very similar setup to the other one in that it is also Oculink and USB-C or Thunderbolt. In addition, this one has an Ethernet port and also an M.2 slot underneath if you want to add additional storage. However, the big detractor to this one is that it has a massive power supply, one that's about the same size as the eGPU. And so I would not consider this one to be as travel friendly, and they both have the same limitations in that they are not upgradable either. And so essentially, when you pay these $650 for the G1 or $750 for the 1X GPU, you're only getting what you can get at that slice of time. Additionally, the performance of this GPU is not all that great either, especially when compared to a desktop GPU like the 3060 Ti. Here are my TimeSpy scores for the WinMax 2. On the top left, we have just the APU itself, and it got around 3000, which is exactly what I would expect, especially given that this one runs at a lower TDP, only 28 watts compared to 45 or 50 watts with the mini PC we were testing earlier. Now on the bottom left, we have the GPD G1 scores, and this is about 3 times the amount of the APU itself. And again, this is about what I would expect coming from this GPU and the testing I had done with it previously. Meanwhile, the same setup but with the Oculink port is quite a bit better, and this is all thanks to the fact that we're using a desktop class GPU. And so we are looking at something that's about 20% better than the GPD G1, and of course it's also fully customizable. And also bear in mind that these are quite a bit more expensive, either $100 or $200 more than the Oculink dock that we have set up from MinisForum. So I think when looking at the major eGPU solutions that I have tested, I find that the MinisForum one seems to be the best deal as well as the best performance. So I think with all that testing out of the way, it's time to start wrapping up and talk about what I like and what I don't like about it and whether or not I recommend it in the first place. As always, we'll start with what I like, and number one is going to be that price point. I love the fact that for $99, we can get a dock solution for things that you may already own. For example, if you have a spare power supply laying around as well as an extra graphics card, you can make a dock like this for about $100. I also love the fact that it is fully customizable. You can bring your own power supply as well as your graphics card and have it customized however you would like. I also think that this kind of customizability allows it to be expandable. For example, if later on you get another better graphics card, you can then use that with this one as well. I also love the performance on this. Because we're using Oculink, we have something very close to PCIe speeds. And I think it integrates really nicely with portable portable systems, in particular the GPD WinMax 2. I love the idea of being able to take that little netbook around to do a bunch of productivity work, but then take it home and plug it in to have a full desktop solution. And once you have the rather frustrating process of installation figured out, it's a fairly seamless procedure after that. It's not quite plug and play, but I still think it's a pretty easy hookup solution. Now, you knew this was coming, but there are some things I don't like about this eGPU dock as well. And I think the big number one here is the fact that it is Oculink only. It really comes down to the fact that there are very limited products that even have Oculink ports in the first place. And so unless you already have a mini PC or a handheld or a laptop that has it, this can get really expensive fast. And sadly, none of the big manufacturers have really grabbed onto Oculink just yet. I think a lot of them are waiting for Thunderbolt 5 instead. Now, I think the way that MinisForum could have approached this better is to have it be Thunderbolt USB 4 as well. I realize that probably would have raised the cost of it, but I'm not sure how much that would be. If they could make that for around $150, I would totally pay for that. In addition, if they added USB-C functionality to it, they could also add additional ports, for example, Ethernet or additional USB, and I think that that would just increase the usability of this dock altogether. I found that when using it with the WinMax 2, I ended up using all the WinMax 2 ports every time. I had to plug in my controller as well as my keyboard. All that stuff took up all the ports on my WinMax 2, and it would have been much more seamless if they had been integrated into the dock instead. And so even though I do love the speeds of Oculink and everything that you can get from it, I would also love the versatility of having it be USB 4 friendly as well. I'd love to be able to plug in my ROG Ally X or Lenovo Legion Go into a dock like this. And finally, this whole eGPU dock solution doesn't seem to be a really great fit for mini PCs, at least for me. There are definitely some advantages there. For example, a mini PC can run at a higher TDP, so you're going to get better performance just overall. And it also does allow you to piecemeal together your desktop setup. You can get a mini PC and then the dock and then swap out all those components pretty easily. However, that's also very similar to the setup when building a desktop PC, so it might be in your best interest to just make a small version of that instead. Like I said before, I think this dock really shines when using it with portable machines, things like laptops as well as handhelds. That way you can use them on their own in a more portable situation and then plug them in for a full desktop experience. It's kind of the best of both worlds. So in putting it all together, you're probably wondering whether or not I recommend the DEG1. And as always, it's really going to depend on you and your own particular use case. I think for $100, it's a really easy entry point, especially if you have a spare power supply or GPU laying around. However, it does have a big limitation in being Oculink only, and I think that's going to be a deal breaker for most people. This connection port is already pretty niche on its own, and so it's really hard to say that, yeah, you should get this dock and also get an Oculink device at the same time. I think a better fit would be if you already have an Oculink device and you're looking to upgrade that solution. In that case, yes, it's a no-brainer. So really, in the end, it's kind of an A-B situation. If you have an Oculink device or plan on getting one in the future, then yes, the DEG1 is an excellent solution and an easy recommendation. However, if you already have a mini PC or a portable device that is not Oculink and you like it, then obviously this really isn't going to apply to you. In a perfect world, MinisForum would make another version of this dock that also has USB 4 connectivity, because I think that will expand things greatly. And so I really do hope that they keep up with this whole dock thing and make new iterations of it, either with USB 4 or even Thunderbolt 5. Because I do love the idea of being able to build out a desktop experience without having a desktop PC. Anyway, that's about it for this video. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Is this whole eGPU thing just like super niche and weird, or are you on board for it and are you interested in this dock? As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.